Hi everyone, my name is Al. I'm a PhD student at EO in the Anthropology and Environmental Studies program, and I'll be the moderator for this panel. We're really excited to be welcoming three stellar anthropologists to speak at the second panel of this conference on the topic, Reflecting Crisis Narratives in Forests, Anthropological Perspectives. A few words about the panel itself. Crises don't always receive the same attention. In tackling crisis narratives and responses, how do crises gain attention? And from whom? When do they lose that attention? Today, we'll be thinking about the conditions of possibility for different kinds of crises among various stakeholders in tropical forests. And our panelists bring to it a wealth of experience. So our first speaker today is Dr. Lai Tak Po. Tak Po is an environmental anthropologist with experience in consultancies, newspaper reportage, NGOs, teaching and training, and independent research. She joined the University Sains Malaysia in 2010. Her primary research focuses on the environmental knowledge and relations of local communities, especially Southeast Asian tropical forest dwellers. She's worked long-term with forest-dwelling Batik, Orang Asli and Pahang, in the knowledge of landscapes and indigenous epistemologies. She's also worked with Khmer and Khoi communities in central Cambodia on their hydrological systems and agriculture. She continues to be interested in forest management and politics, vulnerability and climate change adaptations, the politics of knowledge, Southeast Asian societies and cultures, and the Orang Asli and other indigenous minorities of Malaysia. Our second speaker, Dr. Pauline van Hellerman, is a senior lecturer in anthropology at Goldsmiths University in London. Her research on landscape change, policy, and crisis narratives in Nigeria and Tanzania sits at the intersection of political ecology and historical ecology. She currently holds a Leverhulme Senior Research Fellowship with the project Red Gold, a global environmental anthropology of palm oil. Her publications include numerous journal articles, multi-sited ethnography problems and possibilities in the translocation of research methods by Routledge in 2011, and Things Fall Apart, the political ecology of forest governance in southern Nigeria. And our third speaker today, we have Lark Cake. He's a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford, or he just finished his PhD at the University of Oxford's Department of Anthropology and Museum Ethnography. Yeah, awesome, congratulations. He has studied war-torn Burma's Kachin regime since 2010, focusing on nationalism and nature. His first publications are coming out, including on the Chinese Mitso Mega Dam project, on Kachin popular nationalist worldviews, and on the anthropology of nature conservation. His doctoral research explored how struggles over nature led the Kachin ethno-national movement to encounter Burmese ethnic majority activists and Western biodiversity conservationists. So for the next hour, we'll have our three speakers talk for about 15 to 20 minutes each, after which we'll take a 15-minute break. Once back from the break, we'll have an hour of Q&A, taking questions from the audience. To ask questions, you can submit them in the Q&A box in the Zoom screens at the bottom panel. And we ask that you provide your name, your affiliation, and the person that you're addressing it to, or all the panelists. An example will be put in the chat for that. And just a note, only answered questions will show up. So you won't be able, if you don't see any questions, it's probably not that you're the first, it's just that the only answered questions are showing up. So just feel free to type in, and we'll be displaying the questions as we're answering them. And as typical in most Zoom panels, we won't be able to get to all of them, and for that we apologize in advance. But we do hope to get to as many of them as possible if time allows. And as a reminder, we will be recording the session and sharing it to our YouTube channel, so just be mindful of that. And finally, what is likely and unnecessary reminder, we would like to encourage everyone to be respectful of all speakers, fellow audience members, and volunteers during the conference, as we would like to foster a community of shared learning and respect. So without further ado, let's give a virtual clap to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Lai Tak Po. You have the floor.
Hi, thanks Al for the nice introduction. Because I was concerned about the time, I've pre-recorded my talk, so I am going to share screen now. As I write this, waves are falling on the beach. Down the hill from my apartment, the water is a splendid aquamarine, a bird is calling. As lockdown here has been extended from January into February and now March, as the number of deaths has jumped from 125 for much of August last year to just over 1,000 today, so has the sense of being in a crisis deepened. What does it feel like? It feels like the waves outside my apartment, relentless, without a point of origin, something that's crashing, but we don't know what's pushing the crash onward. That's the crisis that I think we are in. Turning to crisis in the forest, I face a similar tension in myself to put name to what is going on. Around March 16 last year, I spent the weekend with Batik, visiting a few communities, picking up data they had collected for me, paying salaries and collecting more data along the way. On my way home to Penang for another week of teaching, the driver mentioned also casually that the country was going into lockdown the next day. It had just been announced, what we call here MCO, Movement Control Order, was starting the next day, where travel between states, among other things, was banned. Oh well, I shrugged. Perfect timing. I would get home in time for it. By mid-June, conditions had eased, and I rushed back to see Batik and pick up the threads of our fieldwork to examine the ecological, cultural, and acoustic knowledge of gibbons. And so the months of blissful fieldwork continued. Everything was deceptively all right, that I felt safe bringing Batik friends to Penang in August. But then came September, the beginning of the so-called third wave, when a spike in COVID-19 cases put an end to interstate and long-distance travel yet again. This phase, I thought, would last a few months, and then soon we would pick things up again. Nearly 5 months later, I'm still hoping. In the beginning, around March to April last year, the main crisis with regards to indigenous people seems to have been raising funds and resources and making sure that food aid reached the Orang Asli, the indigenous ethnic minorities of Peninsular Malaysia. On their own accord, and often with government encouragement, many communities left their settlements and returned to the forest. The Batik I know, for example, reported that their local health worker had arrived on a motorbike and told them to withdraw into the forest. By June, when I saw Batik again, everybody was out again and life had resumed. They had received government assistance in cash and food deliveries from NGOs and the like. I want to come back to these headlines later. For now, note how Orang Asli responses to COVID-19 are framed, especially with reference to the forest. Talking about which, the forest in Malaysia is associated with the tiger, and the tiger has entered the crisis narrative, starting with news from the Bronx Zoo on 6 April. Almost immediately, the Health Director General, Dr. Hisham Abdullah, was asked for his advice on what to do. And so the news about wildlife sightings and encounters and dangers have come, sometimes a lot of news at a time, other times not so much. These are just two examples. Animal testing, of course, has been a topic. Whether they test negative or positive for COVID-19 is not perhaps the issue that most interests me. What is interesting about COVID is the zone of encounter, if you like, between what's cultural and what's less so. Like this case, an elephant enters a resettlement village in January, just last month. This story was compiled by one of my students, Atsli Yati. I believe this is an Orang Asli school. Others, a herd of 50 elephants, taking the shortest way through plantations after being stranded by a flood. The point I want to make is that while we are all embroiled in the crisis, we have certain expectations that we are in a pandemic of global proportions, and therefore everything should be unprecedented, including the language and conceptual frameworks that we use to think and talk about these new things. But looking at these media paraphernalia, we find little that is actually new. For example, the student I just mentioned complained that media represents wildlife encounters as examples of encroachment, a tired cliche in Malaysian media, and does not shift the paradigm to discuss such other intractable issues as habitat fragmentation. Further, what worries her is that media stories do not talk about animals and humans using anything other than conflict as a trope in the same multi-species world, and therefore do not enable ways to think about animals as other than an ontological other. I want to go back to the tiger and those stories about Orang Asli retreating into the forest. Tigers, of course, are an important symbol in Malaysia. These logos were compiled by another student of mine, Alif. As he writes, tigers are synonymous in my daily life. I don't mean that I live with them or interact directly with them. Yet at the same time, I cannot deny the reality that tigers are everywhere. Less discussed is that tigers are a symbol of forest. For example, one of the Batik's avoidance names for the tiger is I-Herb, animal of the forest. The tiger is endangered, critically endangered. As such, popular representations shift from the old image of tigers as manhunters or killers to tiger as a vulnerable conservation object. The COVID representation was interesting in this regard, as it combined both images as an ambiguous symbol. As symbol of all wild creatures, the tiger was or is regarded as something like a lurking menace, capable of transmitting viruses and also of being infected by us humans. So now we come back to Orang Asli and those representations of Orang Asli as denizens of the forest. There's almost a sense of panic in these media images. Look, Orang Asli are going back to the forest. This is reminiscent of the cliche that Orang Asli must change their attitudes in order to catch up with the modern world. 25 years after I first explored these ideas, the feeling, at least in these media stories, seems to be that Orang Asli, having caught up, should not go back to the forest, should not lari, that is, run. Note that only one of these articles uses the word pindah, to move. I'm still not sure why Orang Asli returning to the forest or retreating or withdrawing from COVID was considered newsworthy. Perhaps this was part of a crisis narrative that the world is unraveling and Orang Asli with it, leaving the villages and settlements for an uncertain home in the forest. Never mind that the forest, in my opinion, is actually much more comfortable than in these exposed settlements. I want to conclude by directly addressing, or maybe tangentially addressing, some of the questions that Al gave to us speakers. I began this paper by reflecting a little of my own state of mind. I think my problem is that I know we are in a crisis of epic proportions, but I can't feel it. Living here under lockdown is just me and the water. It feels like that anyway. The environment is much cleaner, there's relatively less traffic. Social media and high speed Wi Fi connects me instantly to the world, as much or as little of it as I want. As an anthropologist, of course, lockdown means misery. It means being separated from the batik and the forest. And for me, this is the frame from which all narratives must begin. Even as we turn inwards and socially distance ourselves, we are turning away from the people so that they too become research objects. I was discussing with my student assistant what the Malay term for crisis would be. We were speculating that crisis, spelled with a K, or crisis, is probably safest. Another word is gawat, which conveys a sense of mass panic, and somehow gawat is missing from our daily intercourse. Razan's response was, well, this typical Malaysian attitude. Relax, chill, still got enough to eat, so no need to fuss too much. And I think that's basically it. Despite COVID cases rising, most of our needs are seen to. We have an excellent health department, and so we don't actually have to worry that much. The problem, of course, is that while we are comfortable, others are not. And one set of others is the wildlife. For example, in the last 2 or 3 months, there have been news reports of human wildlife conflicts. Most cases involve animals straying into housing areas, plantations, farms, etc., suspected to be looking for food. Other cases included businesses affected by animals, such as cows eaten by panthers, durian farms destroyed by elephants, and honey hives destroyed by sun bears. And of course, there have been accidents that involve animals, such often leading to death. Well, that's what happens when humans retreat. As a crisis, then, COVID doesn't seem to offer much, but it has thrown categories out of whack. For example, in my little corner of the world, the fearsome, majestic tiger is both victim and threat. An elephant went to school. Meanwhile, Orang Asli took to the forest and decided for themselves where was the best place to hide from the crisis. And while some people were suffering badly, living from hand to mouth in dingy conditions, others have nothing better to do than watch the waves come in. COVID-19 is shifting paradigms, but at its most fundamental is shifting space, reshuffling our ideas of what is and is not appropriate. Sorry. Okay, that's it for my paper.
Um, so do we go straight into me now? Or?
Yes, Pauline, go for it.
Okay, sorry, yes, so I will share screen as well. Thank you, Taco, that was very nice, and I was very envious of your beach pictures in particular, and lots to think and talk about later, hopefully. Okay, here, so from the beginning. Sorry, can you see the beginning, the first? Okay, great. Okay, so thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's a nice opportunity to reflect on, I suppose, the whole sort of academic trajectory of thinking about crisis narratives, which have really been at the heart of what I've been doing over the years. And to paraphrase Maurice Bloch, who of course famously said this about trees, I found crisis narratives really good to think with in what I've been doing. So what I wanted to talk today is really about my changing takes on crisis narratives, which I realized as I was preparing this really amount to a sort of, if you like, a crisis narrative about crisis narratives because of sort of different stages of crisis and rethinking things. I will talk through the first four. It's a sort of story of 5 stages. I will talk through the first 4 quite quickly because they're all in the past, and then a little bit longer of the latest current one, which I'm also particularly interested in getting feedback and reflections on. So I will start right at the very beginning, which is when in 1993, when I was a, well, I suppose young undergrad student, history student in Edinburgh, when I read this book by Paul Harrison, The Third Revolution. This was not part of my studies. I was just kind of very interested in those things at the time. But now I hardly remember this book, but I do remember that at the time it had a big sort of impact on me, both in terms of, it was sort of very much part of a growing interest in the whole environment development nexus and what we should do about it, but also, I suppose, really imbued me with sort of classic crisis, environmental crisis narrative thinking. I was going to read this out and now it is blocked out by myself, but I will try. So basically Harrison argues that population growth, rising consumption and technologies, damaging technologies have combined to bring on, sorry, I really can't see it, an environmental crisis, or the biggest environmental crisis in human history. So that's really what the book was about, sort of classic crisis narrative thinking. And so that led me to, later on to actually really study, and I went on then as a next stage to study development studies to deal with these things. So this is now stage 2, 1996, and I was one of the first cohorts of a new MPhil launched in Oxford, MPhil in development studies, which was at Queen Elizabeth House. And I thought I would put in a picture because I suddenly had lots of fond memories of that time. So at Oxford, then one of the person who taught us anthropology, actually the first time I was taught anthropology, was James Fairhead, who of course is, along with his wife, Melissa Leach, the author of Misreading the African Landscape, which also happened to come out that year in 1996. James Fairhead also showed us a film which accompanied this called Second Nature, which starts with a very image of the title page of Paul Harrison, the sort of burning fields and the sort of what looks like absolute crisis, but really questioning those and really showing that actually the reality on the ground, that local land management practices are often completely different and it's not all about crisis. And indeed, this is probably the most famous sort of book questioning this, the Misreading African Landscapes, showing the forest, what they showed was that forest islands were not last remnants of forest in an ever expanding savanna, but actually being expanded by local people through their farming practices. And he also introduced, at the same time, introduced us to a second book, which also edited by Melissa Leach and part of the same sort of crisis narrative work, The Lie of the Land, which I would say is still, for me, the introduction to this book is still one of the best discussions of understanding environmental crisis narratives, how they're produced, how they're reproduced, often passed on without the sort of Latour's black boxing thing, without being questioned, and of course how they're instrumentalized and used for justifying expropriation of land and resources for conservation purposes. So that book, those two had a really big impact on me and really revolutionized my thinking from before. And I was ever more interested in these things. So a few years later then, stage 3, I started doing a PhD with James Fairhead. And this, my project was on the back of a second book James and Melissa had published called Reframing Deforestation, which was a whole sort of follow-up to Misreading the African Landscape, which was just about Guinea, a small local study. This is a sort of case-by-case study of the whole of West Africa, really looking at records, historical records, and showing that deforestation statistics, such as they are used nowadays, are often based on slightly misleading assumptions about the history of forests in West Africa, which has been much more varied, with a lot more sort of changes between forest and open landscapes than we would assume. But they hadn't done Nigeria. So my job then was to do the same sort of thing about Nigeria, which I then did. And I went and I chose Okumu National Park as my research site, because it also has a very interesting history. It is nowadays rainforest, but already in 1947, a botanical expedition showed that it was full of pottery and sherds and charcoal, and basically around 700-800 years ago was full of was farmed and oil palm groves and open and not forest. And that was later also verified by further samples taken by an anthropologist. So that was why I was interested in Okumu. But then when I got there, I had this sort of instant crisis. I found really that that history might have been there, but now it was basically a case of rainforest that was being sort of deforested left, right, and center through plantations, through farming, through logging. And so it was quite hard to find any sort of space for questioning crisis narratives in the current situation. But because I was there and I had to do my research, I continued. And basically what I then found was that looking really deeply at sort of what was going on, land management practices, policies, the histories behind them. I did archival work as well as ethnographic work. And of course, also people's narratives. I kind of ended up with a different take, which is that really there are two, in Nigeria, very certainly, but also really in the whole sort of good governance agenda of the World Bank, that what you really have is a combination of two crisis narratives, of political crisis, that's bad management and corruption, causing environmental crisis, deforestation. And that was very, very prevalent in all the commentators in Nigeria, local people, outsiders. That's really, I'm sure you're familiar with this as well. So that was basically then what my book was about in the end, these sort of, the sort of things fall apart narratives about Nigeria, this identifying this combination of political and environmental crisis narratives, and also showing that actually this sort of whole take on Nigeria and other parts of the world where you always say, roughly things were good in the past, but now you have corruption and bad management. Now things are bad and forests are being destroyed. That narrative is not correct, that actually there are much more complex stories of much longer term historical and in particular colonial roots of current issues, but also that current corruption and bad management are not always quite as bad. And I even managed to find some instances of what I called reverse effect of actual afforestation outside the reserve. Outsiders tend to always just look inside reserves, but what was going on outside reserves was quite interesting. So that was sort of my, I suppose, my contribution to this whole field of crisis narratives, that it's a sort of combination of environmental and political narratives, which I think still is sort of valid and is still a useful sort of critical stance on the idea of good governance, and that you really question some of the assumptions there. But now moving on to stage 4, I suppose, yeah, so that was undergrad, master's, PhD, now postdoc. Stage 4, I did a postdoc on with historical ecologists of East African landscapes, which was hosted in the archaeology department at York in the UK. And it was a project in East Africa now, and I did repeat photography. The others were all archaeologists, but I did more recent changes. And I found some very nice pictures by German missionaries taken in the area, and I revisited those places and took pictures again. And this showed, like so many other repeat, in fact, almost all repeat photography projects in Africa, I've showed clear signs of afforestation or clear tree increase everywhere. Really quite remarkable, actually. All the photos showed this, which contrasted sharply with local accounts, which were not all, but largely all about things are getting worse, it's bad, there used to be big trees, now there are none. So on the face of it, this would have been another case of showing crisis narratives. There's lots of reasons why people would construct, and the sort of false memory, all sorts of reasons why people would sort of have narratives that are not the truth. But I was by that point really hesitant to just do that kind of straightforward crisis narrative paper, or showing that the reality is more positive, partly because of, I suppose, climate change being really more and more in my mind, as in everyone else's by this time, and also, which of course climate change is in some ways the biggest meta sort of crisis narrative of all, but at the same time it's very much not. And I was just starting to think about whether this sort of skeptical crisis narrative take is always necessarily the most useful. And also I was starting to feel very doubtful about kind of just dismissing all these local people's accounts and memories as sort of false and not correct, and sort of influenced by outside sort of colonial epistemologies, and also about prioritizing sort of validating pictures as better than local stories. So for all these reasons, I also started to think a lot more about what I myself or other political ecologists who were working in this field have been doing, which is really that all the counter narratives we constructed are really also just narratives. So I started to think a lot more about narratives as a whole, and I constructed this typology of environmental change in Africa, that basically you have sort of 7 or 8 classic stories, or 2 main groups: degradation narratives and improvement narratives, with different roles for colonialism and local people. But they're all kind of identifiable types, and like the same way that people say about novels that there are only really 7 styles of, or 7 types of novels, that definitely applies to thinking about environmental change in Africa. So I found thinking more and more self-consciously and self-critically about narratives and what we do when I found myself unable to just construct a straightforward counter narrative, and instead ended up writing this paper, which took me forever because I was struggling with it so much, but it did come out last year finally. And it's much more a reflection on both repeat photography as a sort of method and how we use it in combination with ethnography, but also really about narratives. So by this point, I really thought I had once and for all dealt with crisis narratives, and I was actually quite glad to be rid of it all. But then I did the sort of last stage has to be added, which is now in 2019, I returned to Okomo National Park in Nigeria. And this was my first visit since the last time I had been in 2006. So it was 13 years later. And I should also add that just before this, in February 2019, I had what others have sort of very aptly called an epiphany, where you, an epiphany about the the climate emergency, basically. And I do remember this as a very definite moment when I watched one of the first footages of climate marches by young people. I think it was a march of really children it was watching it, but in particular hearing the children's voices, that was like a very profound moment where I was sort of suddenly had this complete sense that I had to really act and do something right now, and that I had to do this as a parent of young children, but also just as an adult now, that was really my duty to do something right now. And I was kind of almost angry, well, not almost, I was slightly angry with myself for all these wasted years of being critical with crisis narratives and not having had this sense of urgency at all. Of course, interesting enough, actually, my lack of sense of urgency was actually mirrored in the wider world. The early 90s, mid 90s were a time of the Rio summit, were a time of real action, and then everyone kind of went into slight slumber, I feel, including myself. But in my case, it was because of crisis narratives. So I was in a very different frame of mind, and that sort of influenced me. So when I got to Cornwall this time, first of all, there was some very positive, I saw some very exciting footage of elephants, which have always been in the forest elephants, which are different to savanna elephants, much smaller. And they're very shy and very, very difficult to see. So now there was a camera footage, which hopefully I can actually show you at the end of this. And that was really wonderful, just to really see for the first time that there really are all these elephants in there. But at the same time, there were really many changes for the worse. Well, first of all, it was very sad and sort of hard to deal with that. I had two very good friends and research assistants, and one of whom in particular was basically really struggling financially a lot. And I hadn't been aware in the last few years. So that was quite hard to deal with. And then also the biggest almost general change was massive increases in insecurity. Nigeria has never been a particularly easy place to live in or work in, but it's become so much worse just in terms of security than it was before. So for example, I used to be able to move around the forest very easily. The forest guards were not armed. The plantation, which I knew well then and which I stayed at again now because of the working on palm oil, completely different. In the past, all these white women used to always just go to the market, walk around, shop on their own, move around freely, and now nobody could ever even just drive around of the white staff, I should say, could drive around the plantation without an armed guard. And I was not allowed to. I always had to have an armed guard, and when I left the plantation, I was never allowed to go anywhere without an armed guard, like a counter-terrorist unit guy. And the whole plantation now had, I think, 5,000 paramilitary staff. So it's complete that which were not there when I was there before. And there's huge amounts of kidnapping and just armed robberies, which are much more than before. Sorry, slightly long side. And then the other change was that there were fewer trees and there was deforestation in many different ways. So I sort of dealt with this first of all, I set up a small tree planting project called Fruit Trees for Schools. And which was a sort of, I suppose, just a way of dealing with all this stuff, and also partly to do with my sort of epiphany of really taking action, but also that, of course, I was now in my 40s, as I said. I wasn't the young, powerless student anymore that who only observed, and I felt I had to take a different role now. So I set up this small school tree project where you plant fruit, because it was somehow lots of people had chopped down trees so there was no shade anywhere, which made it now during the recent visit, and I used to really love just sitting under trees and talking to people, and that was much more difficult this time. But the other thing that happened, and this is the main thing I want to talk about, is that I got very involved in, the other sad thing that happened was that the national park, it was in a bad state. And this was told to me in particular by one of my friends, who afterwards kept on sending me lots and lots of WhatsApp messages about the absolute sort of how much illegal logging there was. I'm just showing you some abstracts, sort of extracts here, but a lot. And he kept on telling me, like, please do feed this on and do tell the sort of people I I know. And basically I did do this now. So I fed it onto, I became myself to various people working in conservation. I was then part of I am now still of a sort of emergency committee of trying to deal with this. And I've now been completely involved in this sort of, we must say, do something about Okomo National Park and the elephants, which are now more and more under threat. I also wrote this letter to the governor, Obaseki. So elephants endangered by illegal logging. As you can see here, I am now the one producing the crisis narrative. But I suppose the main thing I did was I wrote one particular tweet about it, which for once in my life, I am never particularly good at tweeting, but I had a lot of, for my standards, a lot of it kind of went, it didn't go viral globally, of course, but had a lot of reception within Edo State locally. And like 50,000 people saw it, and loads of people commented and retweeted. And it really did have an impact for once. And as you can see, what I wrote, like one of the last places with forest elephants in Nigeria, illegal logging so extensive. Sorry, are you trying to, sorry, if there's, so then that now forests, sorry, elephants are being forced out, destroying crops. So it's a sort of classic crisis narrative, and that really did have an impact. The Obaseki, the governor, did a statement. Loads of people sort of investigations started happening. It's sort of real things are being done, and now I'm also, there's a sort of a special task force was set up, which I'm also part of, which involves the managing director of Okomo Oil, the oil palm plantation. And so sort of things have now, I've sort of taken on a life of their own, if you like. I'm finding myself sort of really talking a lot about how the forest staff need to be trained and armed, basically. And at the same time, one side effect, which I think is now being that, as you can, which is maybe hidden for you as well, but basically these youth vigilante groups have now been set up, which are all armed as well. So they are now working to protect. They have now been employed by the governor to protect the forest. But it is quite, so a lot has been happening, but it is also a new and frankly slightly strange and not altogether comfortable experience for me to now effectively be behind these new youth armed groups sort of patrolling the forest. They have stopped illegal logging. It has now completely ceased. So at the moment, people think of it as a good thing, but it is quite a lot. So I have now really moved on quite a lot from where I was before in terms of this sort of almost comfortable position of critiquing and writing about other people's crisis narratives. But basically, I've sort of really changed my stance in terms of having to engage with climate emergency anthropology and also multi-species ethnography that really ultimately, I suppose the elephants or other animals might arguably need our commitment almost more than anyone else. So who do we sort of try to, and also loyalty to research assistants, all these things I'm sort of struggling to deal with. So these are sort of my priorities at the moment. Okay, I don't know, sorry, I have now lost track of time. Have I gone completely over?
No, this is perfect. This is a perfect transition as well. Thank you so much for that amazing presentation. We can now move on to the third speaker and keep these amazing themes, it's super rich, in mind, and type them as questions, and we'll have a more free-flowing discussion in the second half. But thank you so much. Amazing, amazing stuff. So the third speaker we have is Laura. Please take it away.
Thank you.
Right. Hi. Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming. So today I will try to answer two questions. The first one is, how do nature protectors handle crises that are beyond nature? And by nature protectors, which is a bit of an odd word, I'm trying to include the audience, in this interdisciplinary audience that we have here today, from foresters to environmental studies scholars, practitioners to wildlife conservationists, to everyone who's an environmental anthropologists, as we just heard from the previous talk, to who are in ways environmentally minded. Yesterday at this conference, there was lots of talk about how can we look multi-sectorally, how can we treat biodiversity crisis, climate crisis, and public health together? How can we look beyond one crisis and kind of connect crisis? So that's this question: how can we, the kind of people who are concerned with the nature's crisis, look toward other crises and find those connections? And I guess I will kind of argue that crisis can create apathy toward other crises through this talk. And the second question is, how can ethnography, so the panel is about anthropological perspectives, how can ethnography as a way of writing, as a way of analysis, kind of help connect nature's crisis to other crises, so do this connecting work. And as it's a forestry conference, I thought I would say that ethnography can help by planting empathy between different social worlds and those crises that those social worlds are dealing with. As you know, Burma, as I think many of you may know, Burma is in the middle of a crisis right now. So this woman on this picture is banging pots and pans to drive out the evil spirits. And the evil spirits right now are the leaders of the Burmese military, who on February 1 grabbed power again in the country of Burma, also known as Myanmar or Myanmar. Burma has been under military rule for decades, since 1962, and its healthcare, its education systems, so much of this country has been destroyed by military rule. It is also a country in the middle of endless civil wars. And so February 1 was, for many of my friends, my colleagues in Burma, a day when you woke up in shock. This military coup, as if shattered dreams that had been built in the previous 10 years, when there was a bit of democracy, a bit of kind of opening up, new, less corruption, better infrastructure, there was hope. So there's frustration now. The emotions are a real roller coaster: frustration, anger, sadness, fear of another crackdown, of losing any freedom, of the violence of the military, which has historically cracked down on any resistance with bloodshed. And at the same time, there's a lot of enthusiasm at resistance and a lot of determination. So especially the youngest people who grew up in this kind of last 10 years of a democratic era feel that there really is no choice. They must go to the streets and they must demonstrate, they must protest, and they must initiate and support civil disobedience movements and gather people against this military regime. And so this is a combination trying to show the kind of diversity of people on the streets. You have food delivery people, you have the kind of supporters of the National League of Democracy and Aung San Suu Kyi, the government that was supposed to continue in power. The students and teachers in white, there's doctors and nurses who were at the forefront of the civil disobedience movement, saying that we will not work under this military regime. And there's football lovers, there's people in black trying to show that this is not a movement for any particular political party, but it is a movement against the military regime. And in the left bottom corner, you can see foresters. So somewhat surprisingly, foresters were some of the first people on the streets after the doctors and teachers, at least some foresters. And their uniforms, of course, give a very kind of a visual, symbolic, powerful image, because it's somewhat looks like police. It has this kind of power structure feeling to it. Of course, they are unarmed, but they are visually very striking. So I guess for the audience today, our diverse audience today, I guess I would also invite everyone to reflect: what would you do if there was a military coup? as a forester or as an environmental scholar, as an environmental defender, as a conservationist or so on, would you do civil discipline? How would you react? And a lot of the conservation NGOs in Burma right now are also struggling with these questions. All projects, everything is, obviously on hold. All the plans for improved conservation area management and whatnot, everything is on hold, and the future in terms of donors who will likely retreat from such a troubled country is also very worrying for local foresters, conservationists. Now, what I would like to do today is actually go away from the big city, Yangon, seen in the Delta, and kind of travel to the borderlands of Burma. So Burma, as many of you may know, is a very ethnically diverse country. There's lots of different people, there's lots of languages. And here we can see that these diverse languages are often kind of in these border areas of the country. And that's often also where you find the biggest forests. So let us take a trip up north to northernmost Burma, up the Irrawaddy River to the Himalayan foothills. So between Tibet, between Arunachal Pradesh and Yunnan province of China, is a place called Kachin State, named after an ethnic group called Kachins. Here you can see that this Kachin State area, the northern tip, is one of those Burma's kind of biodiversity hotspots, so high priority areas, because it has these vast ancient rainforests, elephants, tigers, leopards, clouded leopards, all kinds of orchids, migratory birds, and just some of the largest old growth forests in the whole region. And so obviously it's been a place where conservationists come. And thus it is part of a global pattern. In many of the places that our panelists today also are working, where you can see that there's an overlap between forests and a kind of complex ethnic politics, ethnic diversity, and I guess that would be a call for, again, our audience today, for foresters and others to maybe think about how ethnic politics and ethnicity can actually be one of those issues to focus on, or it might be worthwhile to think about specifically as foresters, as conservationists, as nature protectors. So I've been working in this northern tip, this Kachin area for since 2010, and studying the society. It's the Kachin people, slightly less than 1 million people. This area has been, in a grinding civil war since the early 1960s. There's a contested government. Some areas are controlled by the Burmese military state, and some areas are controlled by the Kachin Independence Organization, which is kind of a rebel military state with its own bureaucracy, schools, hospitals, and so on. One of the things I've been trying to study there is how do nature protectors, again, the Western or Burmese or other wildlife conservationists, foresters, and so on, how do they meet the Kachin ethno-national movement, the Kachin Independence Organization, but also the broader kind of Kachin nationalist movement for independence or autonomy? So this is today morning in the Kachin state capital. The police and military broke apart very violently a demonstration just a few hours ago, and arrested some teachers who were doing civil disobedience and so on. So this is this crisis is happening right now. And this picture I wanted to show, it's from a demonstration in a town in the Kachin region, because it starts getting to this theme of ethnicity. So these flags are not the Burmese flags, are not the National League of Democracy political party flags. These are kind of ethno-national flags. So the red and green is the Kachin flag, and the other yellow, green, red is the Shan flag, or Thai people's flag, so connected to Lao and Thai peoples. And this picture, you see the organizers have deliberately mixed them up, trying to say that we have interethnic unity, which usually you do not. There's a lot of tensions, a lot of interethnic divisions. And the protests and the kind of complex shifts of alliances and dreams and loyalties are happening in these borderlands, in these ethnic minority areas, in quite different ways than in maybe the big cities of Burma, like Yangon and Mandalay. So you have a lot of negotiation, how to deal with different ethnic nationalisms, which are not happy about NLD or the Burmese civilian government either. Often are not happy about neither the military nor the civilian government. So they're really looking for ways to articulate their own both support for the Burmese movement, for the resistance against the junta, but also a sense that we have our own purposes. And the Kachin Baptist Convention, so Kachins are mostly Christians, is one of the, has joined the protests. And here you see a kind of Bible verse that they have, they're marching behind. And I guess this is, this is the situation which foresters and conservationists will be entering in this biodiversity hotspot in the coming weeks, in the coming months, in the coming years. It will matter for forests too. So forests, this is a place where I did field work. And sitting here by the lake, looking at those forests in the hills, I noticed how differently different groups of people see the same forests, the same landscapes. So for the conservationists, Westerners and Burmese that I was kind of talking with and discussing things with, they could really help me understand things that I didn't understand. The shades of green, where is old growth forest, where you can see kind of shifting cultivation. You see a little smoke rising up in the picture also burning a field. They could tell me about where the illegal logging operations are happening, what they've seen on satellite photos. They could really read this landscape, and they saw it with, they saw this landscape as a landscape in crisis, and they were very worried about the future of these already rather hurt forests around this lake. They saw this as a refuge where wildlife still is and can return to. At the same time, in the same village, as I was sitting there with the conservationists, I often went to the local Kachin church, to the Kachin community, and talk with them about how they see these forests up in the hills. And of course, the picture is very different because for Kachin youth in the village, for example, this is where their fathers are hiding, because their fathers are often in the Kachin Independence Organization as soldiers. And since the war kind of resumed in 2011, they've had to hide in these forests. So many of those young people have not seen their fathers for the last 7 years, for example. And all they know is that they're somewhere out there in these forests. These forests are also the places where their ancestors had villages in. But in the 1960s, Burma's first military dictator, Ne Win, had them forcibly resettled to the roadside and into the current villages by the roadside in order to control them, because up in the hills, there were a kind of support system for the Kachin independence movement or the rebel organization. So when I look at these forests, I guess there's two crises that are happening there together, and some people see one crisis, other people see other crisis. And what I was fascinated was the gap between these groups of people. So this is a quick kind of a very simplified, quick take on, for example, on how Kachin nationalists, whom I've interviewed and spent a lot of time with, and who I talk with, my colleagues, how they see conservation issues in forestry. Many of the people who even live in the protected areas are not aware that there would be any protected areas here. Of course, there's been a lot of official paper parks all over this area because of the biodiversity. They're not aware of the conservation NGOs and so on and these issues. For them, the much bigger crisis is really a conspiracy, which many people believe and kind of see is done by the Burmese military to slowly destroy our nation, to slowly kind of suffocate the resistance, not only by war, by military means, but also by what they see as kind of secretly orchestrating narcotics addiction among Kachin youth, or orchestrating immigration in order to make Kachins a minority in this land, or by encouraging kind of intermarriage. So these are the kind of things that they see as a conspiracy. By suffocating any kind of mother tongue education and cultural rituals and so on. So they see this as the crisis that they must now stand up to, and they must resist. It's a national emergency. And as Christians, they often see that this may be part of a longer term plan of the Christian God toward the promised land. So when they look at these conservationists, these Westerners or Burmese conservationists and others who come in, you know, first of all, these issues of conservation of nature and forestry, of course, are so low in the list of priorities. There's all these other concerns. There's 100,000 people living in refugee camps right now because of the war since 2011, for example. So that's almost, you know, a huge fraction of the overall Kachin population. There's narcotics addiction, there's all this language loss and so on. So livelihood issues, poverty. So there's this sense that this conservation thing is something very relevant, obviously, and they are coming together with the Burmese state. Thus, they too may be part of a broader Burmese plan to slowly take over control from the KIO, from the Kachin resistance, from the Kachin kind of society in these territories. So there's these suspicions. On the other hand, when I talk to conservationists or Burmese or Western conservationists, through the years, I've noticed that especially people who come there for the first time obviously have never even heard that there is an ethnic group called Kachin there, or there's any kind of ethnic diversity or difference. They're quite unconcerned with such issues. They often consider ethnicity quite irrelevant to the work of nature conservation. And indeed, they find this kind of politics, these civil wars and these ethnic kind of resistance movements and these kind of issues rather an obstruction in the middle of the greatest crisis, which is the planet, which is burning, the tigers and the elephants that are being hunted and traded, the forests that are being cut, the mining projects, the gold mining that is devastating rivers and landscapes. So they really feel that politics is something we shouldn't be doing, and they seem to identify themselves as if apolitical, although of course, from an, you know, the typical anthropologist answer would be that there's no way not to be political, especially in a place of such conflict. But what conservationists over the years have always said, I think, you know, they have lots of different approaches and lots of different NGOs have different ideas. But one thing I think people mostly agree on is they feel like the crisis of nature is now, if we wait until peace comes, which is what the Kachin nationalists often demand they should do, saying that you shouldn't come here before we have a political settlement and end to the civil war, then the nature will be destroyed. By then, the forests will be gone. So you must act now. So I guess the feeling I'm getting from this, and I would be happy to hear how others see this or how they would analyze it perhaps differently, but it's a feeling of kind of apathy that rises from both sides being in the middle of an existential crisis. Both these conservationists, whether Westerners or Burmese, and the Kachin nationalists and the broader Kachin national movement and its followers don't really care about each other. They're living in a kind of a separate worlds. But when you do address the issue mutually, both sides feel kind of hurt by the fact that the other doesn't care about their crisis. So Kachin nationalists feel that it's outrageous that the conservationists are silent at all the crimes of the Burmese military, at the land grabbing, at the violence, at the war crimes, and this kind of Burmese conquest. How can they be silent? And the conservationists similarly feel like we are trying our best to save anything here. It is such difficult work trying to save something, and yet we are being criticized and attacked. And why aren't we rather supported and helped? And there's a mutual sense of kind of hurt at the other side's apathy or lack of concern. And both are actually feeling that they're rather moral actors that are relatively powerless among all these bigger actors, bigger forces, and that's definitely true. There's a much bigger ethnic diversity to consider in this region. There's poverty, there's powerful tycoons that do natural resource extraction. There's all these differences between towns and villages. There's the power of the landscapes themselves, the hills that keep people from moving very fast, that make people really lack access to most of the places. And then there's the Burmese military that is so much more powerful than any other actor there. So what can ethnography and anthropology or sociocultural anthropology contribute? I'm hoping that some of this kind of story that I was trying to tell today shows that what anthropologists can do is explore these encounters across great differences. That's really something we specialize in. And we can show the specifics, the messiness, the complexity, and that simple charts don't do and quantitative analysis often cannot do. And questions for the audience, maybe in the chat box, if people would be interested in sharing their ideas, is how would you do, or how do you see people do? How do you see foresters, conservationists relate with such military regimes, such as in Burma? And how do nature protectors usually relate with such ethno-nationalist movements, such as the Kachin movement? Not so much how they should, but how do you see that this is actually happening? How do these crises meet each other? Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. 1 second to. Right. Awesome. Thank you so much for those amazing presentations. We're going to take a 15-minute break and we'll just round it up to 10 o'clock. So just take a little bit of time to just sit with the really rich 3 presentations. We went from the Orang Asli in Malaysia and tigers. We went to 20 years, spanning 20 years of field work in and out of Nigeria, Tanzania, back to the UK, just kind of like kind of looking through space and time in such fascinating ways, and the ways like there's almost an oscillation, if you let me use that word, of narratives. And Lao's kind of take on the Kachin, which is involved in this contemporary crisis that was unimaginable not long ago, and kind of how nature conservation plays into that, and just very complex and very rich issues. And so take some time to just sit with what just happened, process the kind of information, affect, and just kind of think through questions as well. And we'd love to hear your questions. And there's a Q&A box at the bottom, and there's an example. You can just kind of type your name, affiliation, and who you want to address a question to. And what we'll do in the next 15 minutes before 10 o'clock is we'll try to collate those questions. And we have a number of great ones coming in. And then we have the next 45 minutes from 10 a.m. to 10:45 a.m. to just do a more free-flowing conversation between the 3 panelists. And we're really looking forward to that. So yeah, please feel free to submit questions in the meantime, and just and if you have any questions, just kind of send me or any of the ISTF team a message or in the chat box. Thank you so much, and we'll see you back here in 15 minutes. Go grab coffees and just stretch your legs, and we'll be back here shortly. Thank you. Okay, perfect. Let's get started on the Q&A session. Hopefully everyone's kind of streaming back and will kind of join us shortly. But amazing presentations again. Thank you all so much for both being here, the participants, and the 3 stellar presentations. So I think just to get us started off, something that you might hear a lot and kind of anthropologists use all the time these days is the word ethnography. And I'm wondering if any one of our panelists can just kind of give us like, especially for the ones who are not anthropologists in the room, like what is ethnography, just to kind of begin and kick off the session. And I think Pauline, you mentioned this idea of multi-species and climate emergency ethnography. So can you just kind of give a short definition or how you grapple with that term?
Thank you. I guess I will answer that, but just before that, I had in fact been wondering myself who exactly, or what the audience was like, and in particular, how familiar people are with the whole idea of crisis narratives as narratives, because I've noticed, and it's been very interesting, the different approaches in the other 2 speakers who were talking much more about crises than it would make me realize I hadn't really thought about crises. I've been thinking so much about crisis narratives and not what it means to live through a crisis. But if my talk was, I was slightly unsure whether people were familiar with all that literature on narratives. So yeah, but in terms of ethnography, yes, I mean, it's well, I mean, it's, I have to say by now, I haven't spent ages thinking about it precisely as a methodology. I sort of use it in a really loose way, as in participant observation, observing, talking to people, interviews, that sort of classic sort of combination of being there in the field. And of course, nowadays that's online as much as offline. And then the second meaning of the word is then the writing, the production of writing ethnographies. But I'm actually not one of those very sort of thinking about ethnography anthropologists, I have to admit. I'm sorry.
I'm afraid I'm teaching my class next semester, which is coming up in a few weeks, on ethnography. So I ought to have something to say about it. Basically, it's detailed description, but based on long-term field work, in-depth, and then there's a very strong intersubjective component between you and the people you work with. And right now, I'm thinking about ethnography. I just finished teaching on multi-species ethnography as well, and I'm wondering for young students, they just kind of like, to them it's a difficult concept. They like it, they think it's the way to go, whereby you have ethnography that includes all the other life forms in the environment. But I think my students maybe don't quite realize the difficulties of methodology and so on when you really get down to it.
Yeah, awesome. And I mean, being an anthropologist, ethnographer, there's so much to it. Don't even know where to begin. But I think one way is to think of us as ethnographers or anthropologists. And I think one of the questions that came up was this idea of participating, or from Vivian B at Yale, when you're, I think this can be applied to any panelist, producing this kind of either producing crisis narrative or producing an ethnography. How did the position of the ethnographer and the subject change your research and methods? What tensions or resolutions arose, or both? So kind of thinking about your position as ethnographer and the current kind of thinking about it as like this kind of researcher that you can't really have a field site away and then a home, and they're kind of, the age of armchair anthropologists is like way a long time ago. So this kind of like position between fields, I think Pauline, you went between fields. Taco, you're in kind of Malaysia, you're with the people, you talked about the forests and kind of what happened during COVID, and Lau, you just came back from spending time in with the Kachin and in Burma. So just, yeah, what is your kind of positionality almost, and how do you navigate that? Anyone, feel free to jump in.
Maybe Lau, do you want to start, because you?
It's spoken. It's your turn.
I guess, you know, ethnography is itself already a method that kind of takes over your life in many ways. It is so intersubjective, it is so personal, it is kind of without boundaries, and it kind of overflows. And it is often very much about developing friendships and so on. So, you know, you change when you have new friends. And I guess all of us have been changed by our friends and colleagues in our field sites. It is really the heart of ethnography is that it is not just about kind of arriving somewhere, collecting data and going out, but that you are supposedly the laboratory. Your mind and heart and body is the laboratory that processes the data. So I guess for me, you know, this particular research in Burma, in Kachin has made me less has to connect it to the theme, has made me feel like I am observing or I'm nearby a crisis all the time, because it is a war zone. And And thus, even the coup that just happened is like a crisis upon a crisis. And I kind of guess many in the audience, people who work on the environmental crisis on the planet, may feel similar things, that you are also every day living with a crisis and thinking about a crisis and feeling about a crisis. And in some ways, you are also getting transformed by that, I assume. So,
Yeah, I think transformation, transformation, certainly part of it. The question is, how do you put all that into your account? And so you write for different audiences, you produce different publications, I suppose, because it's. Like this question from Claudia Ochoa, how do you do ethnography in a pandemic? Uh, Agreeing like, oh my God, I don't want to do this. And else, your question is positionality. I don't know how to answer these big questions because I think part of the joy of ethnography is that you kind of muddle through. I don't have a prescription for you do it this way, you end up with that, because like Pauline wrote an article which is what photography on photography. Um, I also consider myself a visual ethnographer. So I think one of the great joys is that you let it take you where it has to go. It depending on context and material that you have, and what the people you work with allow you to do with their information. Because that's the other thing. It's you face a lot of restrictions as an ethnographer if you're really serious to uh, ethically ethical fieldwork. Um, so it's a constant process of negotiation with them and with you. And then as you get older, you also have different constituents. When I first started working here, I joked that you're all my tribe, my colleagues, my students, except that I don't find them very interesting. So yeah, positionality is also something that we constantly developed, and it changes depending on who you're with. So there isn't any firm answer to that. How do you do ethnography in a pandemic? I wish I knew, because I find that we are all in the same. That's what I was trying to say in my paper, that we all enmesh in it. Um, so how do you stand out from something in which everybody else is also enmeshed in, and take the cold light, telescope view of it? Um, I think I suppose social media has to be a big part of what you do, and less so for me than for you guys when you're away from your field. Um, and then you study the pandemic. But I hope it doesn't mean that people sacrifice the what I consider to be the blood and guts of anthropology, which is ethnography, in the field. Sorry, too,
Oh
too
no, that's
much.
perfect. No, that's a blood and guts. I love that characterization of ethnography. Pauline, you were you gonna say something?
I was actually just going to, well, I like what both of you said very much. Also, this idea of us being the laboratory ourselves. I mean, that is actually in a way what my talk was also about, the sort of changing, and as you say, the changing positionality. And that's precisely what I'm sort of grappling with at the moment. It's in a sort of, I suppose, simplistic scenario, you might say the anthropologist sides with the local people and you hear the local voices, and that's sort of what you do. That's what your politics are. But when you have, as I did, forest guards, illegal. Well, I also, I mean, just to say, my whole work before was questioning the idea of illegal, and now in this latest reiteration, I'm the one who's saying illegal logging is going. So I mean, that's very strange for me now as well that I'm doing this. But so you have all these different local actors, including, as I mentioned briefly, the elephants. So I was just going to say one slightly sort of probably not very nice observation, but I do think sometimes anthropologists can be a little bit over ambitious, if you like, calling their work multi-species ethnography, when I think what we probably should do much more is to really actually read the work of the kinds of people who really studied elephants or frogs or whatever, really indeed, and they love them far more than, of course, we studied anthropology, so we don't actually we love people really. So I just think we should, and all those books like, How Do Forests Think and all that, it's often then it's still about the people, and it's actually, we could do a lot more reading and just talking to ecologists, like I feel. And then the other thing in a pandemic, yes, I find it very hard, as you said, Tapo, because it's all the serendipity, also just what is so nice about being in the field is that you're really just there. You don't have to do, once you get there, which is quite hard and setting it all up, but once you're there, it's quite easy because every day something happens, and when you're stuck at home behind your screen, zero happens unless you make it happen. So so if you don't do anything, then 3 days, 4 days, a whole week, a month can pass without, which has happened to me, quite frankly, that you can do so many other things and you do no new research because it's only you who it depends on. So I find that the main challenge. Having said that, of course, what we do now, you just have to go online a lot more, and just there is a certain amount of serendipity and chance and sort of path dependency there as well. But you have to kick it off somehow.
Awesome.
Thank you.
So just taking this a little, just kind of exploring this idea of method ethnographer a little more, Alicia Enton from Yale has a question. So I'll read the question. You spoke about the security concerns about staff on the ground to Pauline, but I wonder if you can speak to whether or not you have concerns for your own safety, as you, in your own words, have started writing the crisis narrative with regards to illegal logging in Nigeria. Are there concerns with becoming involved in advocacy as the face of a narrative? And I think Lau, for example, you're dealing with a very sensitive situation as well. Not sure if you want to speak to that and talk about, just reflecting on how that works with the indigenous people that you work with. Those would be all very productive avenues.
So maybe just because, so at the moment I'm actually doing all this completely from Eastbourne, where I'm based in Sussex. So I'm not in Nigeria. So I've been much more concerned, much more concerned about my friends really, and one in particular, the one who's been sending me all the messages. So I have really been trying not to share his identity with us in any way, because there is a real concern. But yes, in the past, Nigeria is, when I went back now in 2019, it did take me a long time to sort of gear myself up, because I kept on thinking, what if, the sort of ridiculous newspaper article, Eastbourne mother kidnapped in Nigeria, that's not a great way to, I was worried, but of course, as ever, I was, maybe because of the guards, but I was actually fine. It isn't, it very often isn't as bad as that's the whole point, of course. It isn't quite as bad as you fear, ultimately.
In Burma, foreigners are not at risk. There's no history of any big danger. What is maybe what happens in a place like Burma, whether you're an ethnographer or another visitor from the outside, is that the kind of Burmese military state really knows how to make people fear, and it grows a kind of paranoia, and its surveillance systems, it's kind of, especially in this kind of border areas and so on. So that's maybe the risk, is how to balance being careful, mindful, safe, especially about your own friends and your colleagues, but not get too scared. That's the balancing act.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. Just thinking about the role of ethnographer and the kind of risks that you take. The IRB doesn't necessarily cover all the time, and that's a whole other story. So there's a question in the chat that came in from Mustafa Jafari on has the climate change impact on wild animals like tiger been considered? And I take it this is to Tapo. And just thinking more broadly about climate change, if you will, just what are how do people on the ground think about climate change, or does this concept make sense to them?
Yeah, I mean, everybody agrees, I think, and has agreed for 20 years or so, 20, 25 years, that things have changed. We don't quite know how and in what direction, but if you ask somebody in your little notebook, when is the rainy season? Well, it used to be, and then, but now we don't know. It's kind of the standard response that you would get, and I think everybody. But it's like you said earlier, you become apathetic. I think many people become apathetic because it's just naturalized. The oddness of climate change, the weird fluctuations, and so on, all that has become naturalized because we have had to live with it. It's nothing new anymore. Um, so, but I guess if you want to be an anthropologist, you ask, okay, do you have a term that corresponds to climate change? I'd say no. But you have different narratives or different mythologies about uh, things being what they were. And also, you find, I think, I haven't explored this yet, but I think you find that certain mythologies are no longer powerful. I mean, sort of like etiological myths about the origins of things and how things are supposed to happen. People stop believing them because nothing is certain anymore. Yeah, I saw that question about tigers. I wasn't sure what he meant. Um, Considered by whom? So I don't really have an answer to his question about, yeah, tigers.
Yeah, no worries, no worries. I mean, that's just interesting to think about the ways climate change makes sense or don't. And I mean, for example, in Thailand, for the work of um, Chayan Warnaputti, he talked about the ways northern Thai farmers on the ground kind of had there was this disjoint between this kind of global word of like global warming and climate change, which is super complicated in Thai. But farmers on the ground are like, well, yeah, like rainy season. I don't really know the difference in that. So that's interesting thinking about the relationship between language on the ground, what is local, and even that is contested. So yeah, does Pauline or Lau, do you have reflections on climate change and how that intersects with either your research or interlocutors?
Yeah, I can just answer that very quite briefly. This time in Nigeria, I didn't really talk about it before, I have to say, but it was quite striking that my sort of outside the plantation, my friends from before all talked a lot about climate change and a lot about saying how hot it was now, that it's become too hot, like really unbearable. This was partly linked to this. Well, I mean, I don't know, but there really was a complete absence of any shade trees to sit under. And of course, nobody has any air conditioning, and it was absolutely unbearably hot on the plantation. But I mean, and the plantation, though, interesting enough, all the managers there, they were saying there was no actual discernible. They have all this data, meteorological data, rainfall and temperatures, and they said there hasn't been any discernible change actually. But of course, they all also sit in air-conditioned offices all the time, so it would just be the data they rely on. So I don't know, but that was quite interesting actually, the sort of slight differences in what people reported. Thank you.
Awesome. We have another question come in And to all the panelists from Alex Qua, in your years of working with various communities in the field, have you come to realize personal biases that were or are difficult to overcome?
I don't have any biases. Yes, I do. I can't think. What am I biased to? I don't know. I can't think of anything because I kind of like um, going back to positionality again. I'm very much like the people I study. After 25 years, I mean, where does my identity end and theirs begin? Um, so I can't think of what my biases would be.
I find that sometimes I got like a leaf in the wind, that my biases move back and forth based on who I've spent more time with recently. So if I spend a lot of time, say, with Kachin national activists, I see everything everything is about ethnic politics, and it must be. And then um, I I worry that the conservationists or other actors don't think enough about ethnic politics, and then that becomes clearly my bias that the conservationists kind of call me out on. On the other hand, if I spend more time with conservationists, I start seeing their side of the story, and I get, carried away. So I guess our biases are always shifting, but we all tend to think that our topic is the world's most important topic, because why else would we work on it, right? And in this kind of interdisciplinary spaces, like again this conference and like this forestry organization, that's, I guess, the most interesting and challenging part is how to constantly make space for other people's crisis, other people's most important topics, and that's it helps us have a bigger world, I guess.
Amazing. So this idea about biases really connected to positionality and moving with the people, as part of the people, as not part of the people, and just kind of not negotiating those relationships are super important. And I think this question about, there are two questions that come in that are kind of related. So the first is by Ryan. Ryan Smith. He's asking, how do the assumptions that foresters and other environmental groups have about the people with whom we work affect their ability to address the environmental issues with which they are concerned? So assumptions about people of subjects or objects of study, what does that do? And also another question came in by Alicia and Vivian from Yale, saying, how do you as anthropologists interface with dominant crisis narratives in the media or journalism, or thinking about journalism and that role? And I think Takpo, for example, you brought up a lot of newspaper articles, actually all of y'all did, the role of media and journalism. So what assumptions do people have? How does that cause problems? And is that related to the media or journalists or journalism? Yeah, anyone feel free to jump in with if you have thoughts on this. Yeah.
You're posting this on YouTube, right?
Yes, this will be recorded. You can email anything else you want offline, but this will be on YouTube.
Yeah, it's like the ninth Hydra. You cut off one head, and 8 more pop up in its place, and they all say the same thing. um, I find it weird that not weird, I suppose, peculiar, that the media tends to recycle images and recycle metaphors and recycle stereotypes, and it doesn't seem to change. But then, of course, now there's social media, and I hardly know what's going on in social media. It might be radically different. Right now, I'm thinking of mainstream media. Like what are people saying on Twitter? what are they saying on, in below the line comments. That's a whole new universe that I don't even understand. I suppose my students could understand that. So one of these days I'll use them to to do my ethnographic research for me. Um, yeah. What was the question again?
So the first one was about, what kind of assumptions do people make about your interlocutors? So that the orang asli, like, what do people think of them? Have there been any stereotypes? And does this kind of produce problems for environmental kind of interventions or projects?
Yeah, I think so. For example, ideally, local people should benefit from conservation of wildlife or whatever. Uh, there should be of um, local stake in what is going on, and they should be helping to make decisions that matter. And but none of those things happen. Uh, Number one, because I suppose there are vested interests to ensure they don't happen. Number two is I think there's also this images people have. I think I wrote in one of my papers that people in the forest are not supposed to be decision makers, and so it doesn't enter their minds that you should consult with people, and consulting doesn't mean you tell them what to do and they do it. So yeah, so I think if there has been yeah slow there should be more consultation and there should be more progress, but I don't see so much. I mean, there is progress, but it's too slow for me sometimes. That's all.
Interesting. Yeah, do y'all, Paulina, Lau, do you have anything? Just thinking about the ways media kind of intersects with, especially kind of this interesting kind of division between media, like traditional journalists, and social media. So how has that played a role in kind of forestry interventions or your own research?
Well, I guess about journalism, my big concern over the years has been that there's a tendency to want to tell really big stories rather than get into the detailed histories of a place. And I guess that's not surprising. So in Kachin, in northern Burma, there are two big stories that, say, journalists often like to or have to write because they're forced to. One is China's rise. So everything somehow. So I've talked to journalists who tell me, like, look, I can't even sell my story to any newspaper unless I connect it somehow to China. So there needs to be a China in the headline, and then it becomes quote quote relevant. The second thing is kind of desire sometimes in journalism, but elsewhere too, to tell stories of how natural resources are behind it all. Like, we solved the 60-year civil war of Burma because we figured it out. It's not about ethnicity, it's not about religion, it's not about political history, it's not about the commitments of tens and tens of thousands of people on all the sides of the civil war front lines and their visions and their fears. No, it's actually about the jade, or it's about the hydropower, or it's about the gold, or it's about the forest logging or something. Those kind of things are something that is sad to see. And I guess that's another argument for environmental studies people who focus and see the problems, challenges, and realities of natural environment very deeply, to also then it's a call to always pay attention to how the story may be not about the natural resources, but that some of the key issues may be the natural resources may be an outcome of another story, which may be, for example, in the case of Burma, much more about ethnic politics, nationalism, religion, or that there's a real interplay and you cannot reduce the reality to either natural resources or ethnicity and so on. So again, this is why interdisciplinary work and sometimes ethnography can be powerful, because it's about connecting different crises, putting them into one story.
Yeah, and just thinking about this idea of the past, right? And there's a connection that I kind of thought about before we kind of put the panel. I mean, after we put the panel together, was this idea of colonialism and how at some point Malaysia, Nigeria, Burma had experienced British colonialism. So I'm wondering if there is this kind of enduring legacy of colonialism in your field site, or has that kind of, or is that radically so different now that in the contemporary times? And thinking about the role that history plays, is a colonial history a part of it, or should we pivot more to an ethno history or kind of alternative forms of understanding the past? It's a big question, but I'm just interested in the connections between these vastly different, very, very fascinating field sites.
Well, I mean, just from a Nigeria perspective, I mean, yes, there are absolute links, because in fact, one of the sort of first books I read was Raymond Bryant's book about Burma. I've forgotten the title just now, but it's they were clear the whole sort of idea of scientific forestry was really sort of developed in France and Germany, but then really started in Britain much later than in the colonies, and then in India. Burma were the first ones, and then later ones who had been trained in Burma. In fact, the biggest Nigerian forester, H.P. Thompson, was he was in Burma for 12 years before he went came to Nigeria and Malaysia as well. So it's a whole sort of well-known exchange of resources, of expertise and scientific infrastructure. So that is there. And I guess the legacy, I mean, that's what my whole book was about, really. And I'm sure it's the same elsewhere, that the whole infrastructure, the whole reserves, that you have forest reserves as a basic concept, which nobody in the whole world ever questions, as in that you need to reserve a whole area and that you have a reserve and outside non-reserve. That is sort of one of the absolute core principles, and it's never, and that's all colonial. I mean, not original in colonial, but spread by colonialism, and that's still everywhere. So yeah, I would say in all these ways. And then Tongya farming. Tongya farming was also from Burma, actually. But Tongya farming is very big in Nigeria. That's a big thing in Nokomo. The whole sort of crisis narrative about Tongya farming. So that there are all sorts of ways in which there are links and legacies, I would say.
Yeah, no, it's super, super interesting. And just thinking about how we're in 2021 now, but there's still such interconnection between the past, the present, identities in a sense, but also kind of epistemologies, ontologies. And we heard a lot about kind of the various kind of multi-species, but really thinking carefully about what that actually means and what entanglement constitutes. It's a mix, it's a hybrid, but what is that hybrid? I think that's fascinating. And I think we have one more question before I'll ask you to kind of think about some takeaways that you want the audience to have. But the last question is from Dewi Tan from Yale, and she's asking about how does the blame game relate to environmental and climate change transpire to forest narrative crises? And I'd like to add on a little bit what is the role of blame here? Dewi's asking, but is then the idea to reverse the blame? Is there should we kind of push back anti-blame and push the blame elsewhere, or what do we do with the blame? Because as y'all mentioned, this idea of blaming the indigenous people for whatever problems has been a trope in the media that's been recycled in a sense. And in Thailand, if you ask the Karen, they'll be like, yeah, they blame us for all these things happening, but it's really so much more complex than that. And I think that's the kind of nuance and complexity that anthropologists bring that can be better connected to other disciplines and policies. But anyway, so thinking about blame, the role of blame, and what do you do with that? Also a big question. Feel free to whoever's ready.
I mean, one thing I would just like to throw in there now, because you're talking about blame, but I do think one thing that is worth saying is the whole idea of corruption, which of course I did become very interested in working in Nigeria. I mean, everyone becomes interested in that there. But it's that, of course, what I realized only over time is that, of course, the whole idea of corruption is a big blame thing, because implicitly it suggests that the system itself is okay. It is only corruption when someone abuses the system, then that is bad. But it kind of then valorizes the whole world system that we live in, and it kind of puts all the corruption, of course, usually to, you know, these bad foresters in Nigeria, or these bad government officials, or they're always bad. But what really is, of course, I mean, if you look at the whole, I mean, what we now see in the UK, I mean, the whole private-public partnerships thing is so corrupt. It's all the same things. It's just a slightly different language, but it's completely corrupt. The whole thing. Oh, I don't even want to use the word corrupt, but that is the system, and it's sort of yeah. So that's sort of what I think. That's one big thing. The blame thing is always about sort of kind of creating a clean, good world which doesn't exist at all, basically. So yeah, that was a sort of slightly broader point.
Yeah, Lara, Takpo, do you have any thoughts on this idea of blame and what to do with that? And should it be reversed, or should it be nuanced, or how can we deal with that?
You're talking about scapegoating, or
So this idea of scapegoating, it's their fault, or either by the media or by external stakeholders.
I think, as you probably know, being a Singaporean, the political system is so up in the air, and it's not clearly evident from outside. Maybe that I hardly know myself which party is joining up with which other party, and which who is making deals, and so all of that is important. And so I think that those are one set of issues that occupy people's time, so that blaming is not really done so much anymore, except when ministers get involved, and then they blame somebody else when we blame them. So I don't know how you deflect from that, because it's just a question of competence and political, whether they're clean or not, whether they're corrupt or not, and so on. But like the old days where shifting cultivators would get blamed for forest fires, for example, I think that's over.
Lau, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, what comes to mind, and connecting it with this previous question about how do the assumptions that foresters and other environmental groups have about the people affect their ability to address the environmental issues. I guess one of the things that I notice in the Burmese situation is that there's a national discourse about unity, how everyone needs to be united. And what happens in this kind of very powerful discourses of unity is that minorities, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, political minorities, any sort of minorities, are told to get on with it, come along, and not be selfish. And any kind of demands for autonomy, for changing of political systems, for rethinking how we tell history, for just not joining the protests right now, for example. Not immediately coming along to wherever the majority people think everyone should be going. Becomes a game of blame, where you must be selfish that you are not joining the majority. You must be morally corrupt and morally failing And so there's scholars of Burma studies who have talked about this as a kind of Buddhist political philosophy that has influenced Burmese political thinking a lot. Ideas that if you demand something for yourself or you want to separate yourself from the broader community, it is a kind of moral failure and selfishness. And then those discourses, those understandings perhaps also feed into environmental politics. So the way Burmese foresters see things like the Kachin independence movements or other people, Karen, Chan, Mon Rakhine, many different peoples in the country, see their political objections or grievances or complaints as part of that kind of moral failure. And perhaps, and I wonder if sometimes we should consider how Western foresters, Western conservationists get impacted by their local colleagues a bit more, and how easily, if you work every day with Burmese foresters, Burmese staff, Burmese colleagues, how you learn from them about how to think about those minorities in those forest areas, in those conservation areas. And you perhaps also pick up more than you would otherwise this idea that they are being selfish and unity is a good thing, and unity, like will come and everything else is selfish noise. And that, of course, will have a bad impact on environmental conservation because it will ruin relationships between people who are trying to defend nature and then those peoples who live in that nature.
Awesome. For the audience, so sorry, we're running a little over time. We're wrapping up really shortly. And I think thank you all so much for a fantastic Q&A. It's great to hear all the reflections and really careful thought, analysis, work, research in your field sites. And just kind of as a last question, if you had like one or two kind of like short takeaways for the audience, what would you want to tell them, like as a kind of like a takeaway or anything you'd like to leave with them? Shall we go in order? So Takpo, would you like to go first?
Well, I suppose I would urge people to help us think about this question of how do you do ethnography in a pandemic, and how do you do ethnographic fieldwork of crisis narratives or whatever in a pandemic. I honestly don't know. I'm really stumped on this one. So that's it.
Paul?
I suppose mine would be to think about Nigeria and think about Okomo National Park because they're very small and nothing compared to St. Loisa ecosystem in Sumatra, all these wonderful things, but the small ones also really matter, and they really matter in Nigeria as well. So by now I really do care a lot about these forests and elephants and animals being preserved. So if feel free to look it up, think about it. That's my sort of message, I guess.
Awesome. And Lau?
Maybe building on that is that we are in an exciting moment where we have so much more social scientists, humanities scholars, such as us anthropologists, trying to take natural sciences more seriously, ecology more seriously, conservation more seriously, and trying to learn and trying to find ways to participate that we find morally, politically, personally acceptable to our own kind of loyalties. And at the same time, this very conference, it's a forestry conference, but you have a panel on anthropology. What's that, right? So that also shows us that there is an incredible openness and kind of reaching out toward the social sciences and humanities and trying to connect. And I hope that this kind of connecting work does help us see the world's crisis as interlinked and as give us the ability to feel for all those different crises at the same time, and thus also work for solving those. different crises that we have in those different worlds in our little world together.
Amazing. So really this idea that there are so many worlds and how we can connect across them. And I think what anthropology brings to it so powerfully is that complexity, nuance, humanity, but also multi-species in very particular ways. And how they might make sense to people who are local, but also local not being a simple like, oh, they're over there, but really being part of the community in very interesting ways. And so thinking about morality, the role of affect, and just the presentations from earlier, really want to thank y'all thinking about the ontological other in a sense, but also how we're connected to them through the tiger and that ambiguous symbol with the Oranaskli, with the evolving crisis narratives in Nigeria and Tanzania, and how we can think about photography, forestry, colonialism, and all that super richness. And of course, coming to the elephant and thinking about how we can think carefully about conservation today. And Lara with that very, very kind of like, I think, justified and fantastic presentation on Burma and thinking about the contemporary real undergoing crisis right now. So what is the difference between crisis and crisis narratives? I think these questions continue to animate how I think, and I hope how the audience continue thinking about these important topics and the connections we can make to between worlds even. Thank you all so much. We'll now transition to a 9-minute break. I'm so sorry for going over time, but we have 6 very exciting breakout sessions that are starting at 11 a.m. and the Zoom link will be available on the website or in the Zoom chat. And we hope to see you all there. And again, thank you all so much to the participants, the panelists for the questions and the very, very fascinating discussions. And we hope to continue discussions and hopefully meet again in person once this crisis winds down, hopefully soon. Take care, everyone. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.